Thank you all so much for being patient, as Lauren said. I'm sorry, I think because of bandwidth issues, it will be best if I leave my video on. So I'm just going to share the screen with you. Give me a moment. All right, I'm sure you can now all see my screen. So for the larger part of this presentation, I'm hoping that we will engage in active discussions. I will not be using very detailed slides in terms of content, but if we are all able to follow through and pay attention and engage in the discussions, I'm sure that there's a lot that we can benefit from what we discuss here today. So I'm happy to be here to facilitate an exploration of Africa's blue economy sectors, which is what we'll be looking at in this session. What I am hoping to achieve by this discussion is to, on the one hand, give you a clear understanding of the opportunity that the ocean presents Africa with. And then on the other hand, to help you to understand, to a limited extent though, given the time constraints, the complex maritime security threat path that may hinder the advancement of the continent's blue economy. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping that this session will be as interactive as possible. So I'll try and be brief with the presentation so that we can have a fruitful discussion during the Q&A session. So here's something to begin with. A few months ago, a map showing the true size of the world's continents stirred up some very strong debates about whether or not the Mercator projection of the globe, which is what we are so often used to, which is what we are shown in schools, whether this Mercator projection was purposefully popularized as a means of making Africans oblivious to the immense wealth of resources that we really have at our disposal relative to the Western world. And here's why. So for purposes of nautical navigation, this Mercator projection that I'm talking about stretched up and sort of warped the sizes of countries that were further away from the equator. So what this means is that in the maps that we are all most likely used to, Europe, USA, Canada, and Russia, for instance, are all projected as much larger than they really are. So in reality, the dark portions of this map is what reveals the actual sizes of the countries or continents. I am hoping that my cursor can be seen moving about. So I'm just trying to indicate that these darker portions show the true sizes of...
We are seeing your pointer.
Good. So these darker portions show the true sizes. So you realize that on the lower part of the equator, the sizes are more or less retained. But as you move above the equator, the projections are much larger than they really are. Okay. And to give a clearer perspective, here's the size of the US in relation to Africa. So you can see a map of the US sort of overlaid on the map of Africa. And typically, this is not what we see when we look at the Mercator projection. And again, here's all the major countries that we can fit into Africa. So you take a close look at this map and you can see how, for instance, we can conveniently try to fit in the United States, China, India, Eastern Europe, Germany, France, Spain even, into our continent. So why am I touching on this? I'm about to get to that. Essentially, the whole uproar about the popular Mercator projection and how invariably deceptive it is has centered on a united Africa's true land mass relative to other countries, and how this truly projects the wealth of, of land-based resources that we have as a continent. But my argument here is that perhaps there's a different way we can be looking at this. Because if we consider Africa's borders as largely surrounded by the ocean, then we begin to understand, especially from looking at something like this, that we have sort of perceptually underestimated the wealth of our maritime estate relative to other continents, simply by looking at the Mercator projection. Okay. And this is even more true when we recognize the fact that Africa's blue economy is really not just limited to the ocean. It includes our lakes, our rivers, our underground water, and all the productive sectors that draw from these. Like, for instance, fisheries and aquaculture, tourism, maritime transport, energy, and a host of other related sectors. And essentially, this posit was brought forth in Africa's Blue Economy Policy Handbook. This notion of the fact that the blue economy shouldn't just be limited to perceptions of the ocean space, right? In a sense, our brown water economy is also inclusive. So yes, as I've said, our blue economy is not always blue. The blue economy concept in its entirety is sort of a holistic appreciation of the economic benefits that can be derived from sustainable exploitation of not only our oceanic ecosystems, but also our freshwater ecosystems. So now, in terms of the continent's most prominent blue economy sectors, we have fisheries, we have maritime transport, we have maritime tourism, we have offshore energy or oil and gas sectors. My presentation will largely center on fisheries and maritime transport so that we do not take much time. As I said, I want us to have a long interactive session. But hopefully the Q&A session will allow us to skim through a few aspects of the others. So let's take a brief look at fisheries. Now, currently it's believed that fisheries and aquaculture contributes over $24 billion annually to our African economy. And if a lot of you are familiar with the statistics, then you would know that the fisheries sector alone is also believed to provide employment to more than 12 million individuals across the African continent alone. And what I'm mentioning here constitutes both fisher folk and then those directly engaged in fish processing. But if we are to extend this to other points along the fisheries value chain, we would have an exponentially higher figure. So just to put this in context, in Ghana alone, we have over 2 million people whose livelihoods depend on fisheries. That is, those who are either directly engaged in the fishery sector or those who can be found along the country's fisheries value chain. And here's the interesting fact that has previously been presented by the World Bank. The multiplier effects when it comes to beneficial engagement in Africa's fishery sectors are really fascinating. So for example, for every fisherman who is actively engaged in fishing in, say, Mauritius, we have at least one other job created inland. So if you look at the hundreds of thousands of fisher folk who can be found in the region, then you can get a sense of how many inland jobs are created as a result. In Guinea, the ratio is even higher. We have more than 3 inland jobs created per every fisherman or fisherfolk. So we have a clear evidence of how the fisheries value chain can positively impact the livelihoods of several other individuals who may not be directly engaged in fishing. So again, this is just one aspect to the fisheries matrix. Beyond its benefits to Africans as an economic activity, we can begin to look at other benefits that we derive from fisheries. And one is the fact that over 200 million Africans depend on fish as their primary source of protein. And what's more, the FAO has projected that well into the future, by 2030, total consumption of fish on our continent would likely increase by 27% from 2018 levels. So we see here that Africans need fish for nutrition in as much as we need it to support our livelihoods. But when it comes to fish, it doesn't really end here. For several decades, the fisheries sector has been considered as one of the most viable avenues for advancing women empowerment across the continent. And why is this? It's because women play an integral role in Africa's fisheries sector. We often think of women's engagement in our fisheries sector in a very limited sense. In the context of Ghana, for instance, when we think about women involved in fisheries, and I'm sure this is the same for other countries across the West African sub-region, we normally think of...
Steph, I'm sorry to interfere. I'm very sorry, but
yeah.
Your slides are not showing.
No, I'm doing more of a conversational presentation.
Okay,
so the next slide is on a different issue.
All right, thank you.
I hope that's okay. Are you able to keep up regardless?
We will keep up.
Okay. Yes, we are following.
Okay, perfect. So I was talking about the role of women in Africa's fisheries sector, and I was just narrowing it down to West Africa and mentioning the fact that normally, and I'm sure most of you who are from West Africa will agree with this, when we think about the role of women in fisheries, we normally think of fishmongers or processors. We think of women as fishmongers. The reality, though, is that in several parts of West Africa, women are increasingly shifting from the periphery to the core of the fisheries sector through direct ownership of canoes. So we have several instances where women own the canoes that the fishermen actually take to go out to sea. We have several instances where women actually manage the resources from fishing expeditions. But normally we just perceive them on the sidelines engaging in the fish processing activities. Now, the exciting thing about women moving to the fore of fisheries is that it has several undertones for economic advancement and sustainability. So, for instance, there's a post I came across recently on UN Women of a 68-year-old woman who defied all odds in her community in Senegal by becoming the first fisherwoman in that vicinity. You can imagine the sort of obstacles she had to overcome to venture into going out to sea in the first place, because there would be a lot of notions that she would not be able to do such a thing. But the thing is, I mean, what's interesting about this story is that this woman called Yayi Bayam Diouf didn't stop there. You know, beyond going out to sea to fish, she took active steps to empower and train several other women within her community to engage in sustainable fishing and aquaculture practices as a means of earning a living. And this training is being replicated. The UN is trying to replicate some elements of this training across a few other West African communities. So there are several other notable instances of women taking charge of fisheries conservation and sustainable fishing within their own communities across Africa. And because of this, we can comfortably come to a recognition of the fact that actively empowering women in fisheries can have ripple effects across entire communities. So just to seal this in, okay, because we were talking about some of the benefits that we derive from fisheries. Fisheries as a blue economy sector really produces three-pronged benefits for the continent. We have benefits in terms of supporting livelihoods. We have benefits in terms of providing nutrition and empowering women. And then we have the fact that it's not just women who may be impacted in the long run. Other vulnerable groups across coastal communities could also benefit from the engagement of women in fishery sectors. So it is really quite troubling to know that despite its importance as a blue economy sector, the fishery sector in itself houses one of Africa's most pertinent maritime security threats, which is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU for short. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, if I say IUU, I'm referring to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Please feel free to take notes if that will help you to recall some of these concepts better. So now these illegal fishing practices, whether they be unlicensed fishing, each year due to IUU fishing. And when we sort of expand this across Africa, then we really begin to get a sense of the immense revenues that we lose from allowing illegal fishing practices to deepen and then to proliferate across our continent. Now, a second aspect that I wanted to touch on is maritime transport, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm sure we are all aware that Africa relies very heavily on ships and ports to service its intercontinental trade. So what this invariably means is that maritime transport is one of the major anchors of the continent's economic growth and development, right? And as most of you may also be aware, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement came into full force on 1st January 2021. And that was a significant milestone for Africa's political and economic goals, right? The deal invariably created a huge single market for our continent's 54 states. Now, the interesting thing is that while we would expect that, given the fact that the continent includes a large number of land-linked states and just a few islands, that most of this trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area would when we consider this, then we realize that Africa's maritime transport sector is not just a crucial blue economy sector. Maritime transport is not just limited to its benefits for the blue economy, but for its benefits to broader economic growth and stability on the continent. Interestingly, again, it is in this same area of maritime transport that several individuals observe the entire maritime security threat path. I'm sure that prior to engaging in this program, several of you participants may have believed that when we talk of maritime security threats, they are often linked to threats to the shipping and maritime transport industry. Of course, as you begin to learn from this course, maritime security threats are often much broader than that. We normally have, we earlier discussed the threat of IUU, which may not necessarily be a threat to maritime transport or shipping, but which certainly is very notable in terms of its impact on livelihoods across the African continent. So here we have an overview of the threat path I was talking about. So normally we think of maritime transport and we may be familiar with threats such as piracy and armed robbery at sea. We may be familiar with threats such as drug trafficking. We may also be familiar with illegal migration or illicit trafficking in persons, illicit trafficking of goods also. Now, piracy and armed robbery at sea has usually taken the fall as the most prominent of these threats to maritime shipping in Africa. And the hotspot for this criminality of maritime piracy and armed robbery at sea for several years, with the exception of last year, was the Gulf of Guinea. Now, to break it down a bit for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, piracy and armed robbery at sea usually involves targeted attacks on ships, on vessels and offshore platforms for economic gain by the criminal groups involved. Now, this is a highly untechnical definition because the law of the sea, more specifically, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, actually provides a clear distinction between piracy and armed robbery at sea. But let's stick to this for the purposes of this presentation or this discussion. So it's worth noting when we talk about this threat of piracy that because of piratical incidents in our waters, the Gulf of Guinea was characterized as the most dangerous region for seafarers across the globe. And so that places Africa at the middle of what then was a major maritime security crisis. Of course, I mentioned that piracy and armed robbery at sea usually occurs for the purposes of economic gain by the criminal groups involved. The motives and the approaches to attaining this gain have shifted over time. So we would, for instance, notice a shift in the trajectory of piracy attacks from oil theft, which was what pirates usually used to engage in. They would attack oil tankers or vessels transporting oil and then steal that oil to sell on international black markets. Now, I'm saying we've noticed a shift in trajectory from piracy attacks aimed at oil theft to kidnapping for ransom. So in this instance, we often witness pirates kidnapping crew members and requesting large sums of ransoms to be paid before those crew members are released. Because of the highly fluid and interconnected nature of the ocean space, and then the multi-state nature of the Gulf of Guinea region in particular, the threat of piracy and armed robbery at sea grew into a very pervasive one. You would notice the criminal groups straddling multiple jurisdictions so that it would be difficult not only to arrest them, but to figure out exactly how to conduct investigations or prosecutions for the offense. So this is just to give you an overview of piracy as a threat to the maritime transport industry. Now, again, like I mentioned, I'm hoping that the Q&A session will allow us to talk a bit more about some of the other blue economy sectors. But let me just try to round up with a few discussions on a number of elements regarding thinking around Africa's blue economy sectors. So typically, we are often tempted, again, as per the very subject of this discussion, to look at the continent's blue economy on a sectoral basis, rather than to view it as a whole. The challenges to this are, much like you can even sense as a result of this presentation, we are often limited in our focus, and then tend to perceive the blue economy as being limited to just the most prominent sectors that we might be used to hearing of. So for instance, we would normally think blue economy and think maritime transport and shipping. To a limited extent, we may think blue economy and think about the fisheries industry. To a limited extent, and particularly for the coastal regions, we may think blue economy and think of maritime tourism. But if you recall from the beginning of these discussions, the blue economy actually encompasses a lot more than that. When we think about the blue economy in general, we should look at the entire gamut of ecosystems, be they oceanic, that's ocean-based, or land-based in terms of the water bodies that are found inland, and then the opportunities that we can derive from them to advance the continent. Thinking in this broad sense will allow us to be able to approach the complex threats that the blue economy faces from a broad-based focus, because a lot of times you will find that some of these threats are often deeply interlinked. So as an example, you would realize that the threat of IUU is not limited to the fishery sector, because IUU is often interlinked with several other forms of transnational organized crime occurring in the ocean space. So you'll see from this chart here, where we have the threats linked to maritime transport, that we have illicit trafficking in persons, we have drug trafficking and illegal migration. Interestingly, each of these three threats can also have deep linkages with the threat of illegal fishing. Vessels that are engaged in illegal fishing activities have often been found to be engaged in other forms of illicit trafficking, such as illicit trafficking in persons. In instances across West Africa where stocks are largely depleted and where vessels may be unable to engage in fishing practices as often as they would, they often end up diversifying to engage in other forms of transnational organized crime. And that is where you would find these same vessels being used to conduct illegal migration activities, or being used to conduct drug trafficking activities, and so on and so forth. So the important thing is to look at the blue economy holistically, so that you can begin to get a full understanding of the range of maritime security threats that the entire ocean space faces. And this is very important because that is the only way that we can actually work towards collectively advancing Africa's blue economy sector. So I'll conclude here and see if there are any questions that will allow us to delve into deeper discussions on this. Thank you. Lawrence, are you there? Can I begin to address some of the questions and comments?
Yes, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Stephanie. Quite a lot of interesting statistics there. I would like to go to the chat box now and take some questions. I'll take this one from Evaldo Fumo, and is asking, can we relate piracy to terrorism activities? Stephanie, this is for you. Can we relate piracy to terrorism activities?
Yes, we actually can, because there is an entire threat path that is often referred to as maritime terrorism at sea. Now, the thing though is that if we are to delve into the technical definition of piracy as provided by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, then it will be difficult to establish this linkage, because the convention specifically states that piratical activities are conducted for economic gain. Okay, but we would realize most often than not that terrorist activities are never really conducted for economic gain, but to send a clear political message. So in the sense of the stipulations by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it would be difficult to establish that linkage. But when we come to the reality on the ground, you realize that groups that are engaged in criminalities or in piratical activities can easily find themselves operating within the maritime terrorism sphere, especially when we consider the origins of the death of piracy that we have in the Gulf of Guinea as it is now. The primary piratical hotspot in our region was Nigeria, because to a large extent, piracy originated within the Niger Delta region, where the offshore exploitation activities by large corporations really created a lot of environmental disturbances for communities that lived in the Niger Delta region. Not only were they noticing a depletion in their fish stocks and other resources because of the oil exploration activities and because of some of the spills that resulted from them, but there was very little compensation given to the communities for those shortfalls. So at the end of the day, what was observed was a rapid diminishing or depletion in the livelihoods of individuals dwelling in the Niger Delta region. A lot of them then began to engage in these piratical activities as a means of rebelling against these offshore exploration activities. So to a large extent, if you delve into the motives, beyond the fact that they did need to make some economic gain to safeguard their livelihoods, if you delve into the motives, piracy really originated within the context of the Gulf of Guinea as a form of comeback by these piratical groups to send a clear message to those who were actively engaged in the offshore, to the large corporations that were actively engaged in the offshore exploration activities in the region, which is why I'm saying that in reality, you can find some linkages. It's certainly possible for groups that have been engaged in piratical attacks for economic gain at one point to be willing to switch to attacking offshore platforms, for instance, if they feel like those exploration activities threaten the livelihoods of people within their community. And this was the case in, I believe, 2008, where there was an attack on an offshore platform called Bonga in Nigeria. It was more of a maritime terrorism attack, but it was believed to be perpetrated by the same criminal groups that were actively engaged in piracy in the region. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Thank you for the extensive reaction, Stephanie. I'll take this one from Oas. He says that, do we have a clear legal framework to handle cases of piracy in West Africa?
Sorry, can you?
This one is from Oas. He's asking if we have a clear legal framework to handle cases of piracy in West Africa.
Okay, thank you for asking that, Ohad. Now, it gets quite technical when we look into that. If you are talking about a legal framework to handle cases of piracy in West Africa, it may be a bit flawed to look at it in that sense, because in a sense, although piracy is a regional problem, affecting the entire Gulf of Guinea region, in order to be able to give piracy incidents the legal finish that they need, national legislations have to be in place to support the prosecution of pirates. So it's not just in the broader West African sense. If the individual countries in West Africa do not have national legislations in place to ensure that piracy cases are prosecuted, then it could be the case of, for instance, there was a piracy incident in 2018. I believe that was the Marine 711. You could have instances where the pirates are actually captured, but then there would be the question of which of the states to prosecute them, because a lot of times you have them beginning the perpetration of the act along the coast of one country, and then moving the vessel to another country along the coast, where, for instance, kidnapped seafarers are then transferred onto another vessel, and so on and so forth. So because of how these acts kind of straddle the coast of several different countries, it's important that each country has the legislations in place to be able to prosecute the offenses. In the case of Ghana, for a long time, there was no national legislation that allowed for the prosecution of pirates. What this meant was that even if we were to arrest pirates, we would be incapable of prosecuting them and, for instance, giving them adequate punishment, such as jail time for the offenses that they committed. I hope that answers the question. But just to add to that, several West African countries, in fact, I believe all West African countries at this point operate under the framework of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, as well as other international agreements that are aimed at addressing crimes at sea. So we do have an obligation to cooperate towards that end. But beyond that obligation to cooperate towards addressing the issue of piracy and armed robbery at sea, again, like I've said, at the national level, certain elements and systems have to be put in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take this question from Linda, and she's asking, in your view, where should the starting point be in dealing with the threats to the sub-region's ocean economy?
Okay, thank you very much, Linda, for asking that. You know, the conclusion of my presentation to some extent gave me away on this because as I mentioned, in trying to address the range of threats that we face, it's always ideal to have a holistic picture. Now, we weren't able to delve into the nature of maritime security threats that the region faces. But if we were able to take the time to go into an exploration of all the threat paths, we would realize that, as I mentioned earlier, there are several linkages between these threats. And we would also notice that each of the threats have a broad range of security implications. Threats at sea do not only affect food security, for instance, when it comes to fish. You'd notice that they affect economic security, environmental security, and more broadly speaking, human security because of their impacts of on livelihoods across the continent. So what is really important is to begin to look at the threats that we face from a holistic perspective, to begin to explore what are the drivers and enablers of these threats, and then to see where the interlinkages are. If efforts are put in place to address the issue of, say, piracy and armed robbery at sea, supposing adequate regulation and enforcement is put in place to address the issue of piracy, what we then have would be a criminal group that can no longer conduct piratical operations, but that clearly understands how piracy and armed robbery at sea can be linked to other criminalities at sea. So because their primary range of operation has been within the ocean space, we could find some of these criminal groups shifting to engage in other forms of crimes at sea. You could find the same piratical groups realizing a loophole in regulation and enforcement measures against drug trafficking, for instance. And once that loophole is found, we would have those same criminal groups engaging in drug trafficking activities. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we can also establish so many linkages between IU and several other criminalities at sea. We also know of instances where there are such deep-rooted human rights violations at sea. So it's really important to look at the threat paths holistically, so that in whatever approach we take to address one threat, we consider the ripples that may sort of move on to the other threats within the region. And of course, I may have been giving examples about the Gulf of Guinea, but this is really a continent-wide issue. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take this one from Ohas again, and he's asking, how do we achieve sustainable ocean governance to handle illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in West Africa?
Thank you, Ohas. I'm really glad you asked that because, interestingly, my colleague Lawrence and I have been discussing some of these issues quite a bit lately. The thing is that IUU has a whole lot of political undertones. The reason why it is so entrenched within the West African sub-region in particular is because there are a lot of beneficial interests in IUU. Typically, whereas vessels that engage in illegal fishing practices stand to make millions, sometimes billions of dollars per year from operations, usually the fines that are slapped on them whenever they are found to be engaged in illegal fishing practices is only a small percentage of their profits. So to put this in context, for instance, one study found that fines could be up to 80% of the profits that the vessels earn from a single trip or a single operation. So if the fine is just 80% of what I would earn from a single operation, then there's no reason to necessarily view the fine as something that would push perpetrators to stop committing the act. They would much rather continue to engage in illegal fishing practices, because regardless of the number of fines they incur, they will still generate more revenues, exponential profits from engaging in the act. So if we consider all these variables, and then we consider the fact that, for instance, in the case of Ghana, where there's the issue of beneficial ownership of vessels being from other countries, despite the fact that Ghanaian corporations are used as front companies, you would also begin to notice certain undertones of corruption that have deepened this element of IUU. So what then is important is to enhance transparency in the West African fisheries sector. Once we have more transparent processes for instance, registering or licensing vessels to be licensing the vessels that fish in our waters, we will have more individuals probing into whether or not certain illegalities are being committed, whether or not there are certain undertones of bribery and corruption, and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, transparency is key. Without transparency in the fishery sector, it would be difficult to even detect the criminalities occurring in the first place, let alone to prosecute them. We all know that the ocean space is quite vast. We all know that resources to engage in maritime regulation and enforcement, fisheries regulation and enforcement are rather limited. So transparency is a crucial first step. Thank you.
Thank you for a concise response, Stephanie. Urias is asking, considering the lucrative nature of piracy, which equips pirates with sophisticated weapons, are all countries along the GOG region well equipped to easily curtail this from frequently occurring?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Urias. I think it's interesting that you should say this, because the pirates are not only just equipped with sophisticated weapons, but recently, I mean, with the exception of 2021, there was definitely a trend of attacks becoming more violent, more brazen. There was definitely a trend of attacks also occurring further offshore, which previously local authorities could not have envisaged happening. So we have instances where, yes, pirates are very equipped to conduct their operations, where they have all the tools and equipment that they need to be able to engage in piratical activities. What is interesting is actually that while piracy may occur offshore, you would notice that piratical activities are usually sponsored by what we normally call a piracy kingpin. So we have individuals who may be inland, who may be in the helms of power, supporting these operations, providing the pirates with the illicit finances that they may need to acquire whatever tools and equipment they need to be able to perpetrate their acts. So we realized that over time, the pirate groups have evolved to be overall more effective in their operations. And of course, once you look at that aspect of things, it's useful to consider whether countries along the Gulf of Guinea are actually equipped to fight back and address this piratical threat? Typically, the response would be that a lot of improvement is needed. Of course, states like Ghana and Nigeria have recently taken steps to acquire certain, and pardon me on the technicalities, but certain vessels and tools and equipment to be able to adequately address the threat of piracy and armed robbery at sea. But it really is never enough. We've also noticed, for instance, a shift towards some form of international interventionism in the Gulf of Guinea region. We have a lot of instances where, for instance, Danish frigates patrol our waters in a bid to also play a role in addressing the issue of piracy and armed robbery at sea. And there definitely are some contentions as to whether this is the way to go. Truth is that the capacity of Gulf of Guinea states may be limited, looking at the extent of the threat of piracy and looking at the conditions that make piracy and armed robbery at sea in itself lucrative for the criminal groups involved. Bear in mind that they are able to easily just cut across several different borders. Oftentimes you'd find pirates hijacking a vessel and quickly changing the name of the vessel so that it is difficult to detect. You have them immediately disabling the AIS systems on the vessel so that those vessels cannot be tracked. And because of all of these contingent factors, it is very difficult to be able to track and trace pirates and then to arrest and prosecute them. So there definitely is greater capacity that is needed amongst Gulf of Guinea states to be able to address the issue of piracy and armed robbery at sea. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. I like the way you are able to elaborate on the issues and make references to incidents and active efforts in the region. Thank you very much for your responses so far. I'll take this one from Uzoma, and he's asking, it's safe to say that all countries have a defense ministry or security agency and facilities for gathering intelligence, especially related to the campaigns you mentioned. What do you think can be done to make maritime security a top priority for these defense ministries?
Thank you so much for the question again. I think you are definitely right. If you take the case of Ghana, for instance, we have a whole complex mix of agencies that have some role to play in addressing the issue of maritime safety and security. In all, if you look at the roles and mandates of the various agencies, we could identify about 20 public agencies that have a role to play in maritime regulation and enforcement, whether they be the Security Council, the National Intelligence Bureau, formerly the BNI, Bureau of National Investigations, whether they be the Navy, the Air Force, the Ghana Maritime Authority. We have a whole mix of public agencies. And overseeing these public agencies are also a whole array of ministries that could have some role to play when it comes to maritime regulation and enforcement, when it comes to maritime relations and diplomacy, when it comes to maritime justice administration, for instance. Of course, the fact that there are these broad array of agencies involved does not necessarily mean that it has typically been a priority for governments or for defense ministry. What could be a viable approach to prioritizing this on national agendas could be, for instance, to have integrated maritime security strategies or integrated maritime strategies across the continent on a national level if need be. I know that Ghana has taken steps to develop a national integrated maritime strategy. GOVMI was part of the process of trying to get the content of the strategy together. So this could be one of the viable means of placing this on the national agenda. Of course, it's not just about coming up with a strategy, because I mentioned the elements of a whole mix of agencies involved. And this is not just the case with Ghana, this is the case with several countries across the continent. There's the need for such maritime strategies to provide some form of structure for interagency collaboration, so that these agencies can all work together towards the ultimate goal of enhancing maritime security. So if we have a situation where the agencies are functioning according to their mandates, but in a disjoint manner, we'd realize that the flow of information that is needed to ensure adequate responses to maritime security incidents as and when they occur will be lacking. So yes, just to reiterate, a top priority could, for instance, be to develop national integrated maritime strategies that provide a structure or a framework for the coordination of agencies that have a role to play in the maritime space. To be honest, there are several proponents who argue that states should begin to establish entirely new ministries to handle matters relating to blue economy, the ocean governance, and maritime security. Ministries of oceans, for instance, or blue economy, or so on, entire ministries that are dedicated to this task. And I think that could also be a viable pathway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. On ocean pollution, Blankson Jaffet Tete from Ghana is asking what measure of enforcement can be employed both national and international level to clean our ocean.
Yeah, thank you for steering this discussion to the issue of pollution, because that is certainly one of the major areas that we need to be looking at. Unfortunately, the presentation did not afford us time to delve into those areas, but we can definitely try to touch on it a little bit as I address this question. The interesting thing is that when it comes to elements of marine environmental protection, you'd realize that once again, they sift across several elements of the other maritime criminalities that may be occurring in our waters. For instance, there are several aspects of illegal fishing that directly damage the marine environment. Bottom trawling in some instances has been known to devastate marine ecosystems. We have several fishing practices that normally involve discarding of either some foreign materials into the water that definitely have very hazardous effects for the marine environment. Interestingly, a large percentage of marine litter is actually discarded fishing nets, and this again has very dire consequences for the marine environment, especially where we have species being caught up in these nets and unable to escape. It's interesting when I talk about these intersections, because recently there was an incident of illegal bunkering in Ghana where maritime enforcement authorities actually clashed with the individuals who were engaged in the illegal bunkering. Just to put it in a layman's sense, let's just think of illegal bunkering as a form of oil theft. So this oil was siphoned and was going to be transported into tankers, which would then sell them off on black market. When the Maritime Authority clashed with the criminal group that were engaged in the illegal bunkering, because they did not want their shipment to be taken by the authorities, they perforated the dendes, which are the special canoes that carry these illegal shipments of oil. And then the oil then spilled into our waters. And it's interesting how this was not really looked at as an issue of marine environmental pollution, but it is. That simple oil spill will have devastating effects on marine life within that portion of the ocean where it happened. So I think it is important to look at the elements of other maritime security threats that may directly impact the marine environment, and to also begin to look at other direct threats to the marine environment, such as plastic pollution, which is becoming such a big and topical issue lately. I mean, estimates show that if not much is done to address the situation, there will be more plastics in the ocean than fish by 2050. Now, to get straight to the question of what enforcement measures can be put in place to at the national and international level to clean our ocean. Thankfully, on the international front, the UN Environmental Program spearheaded a process to begin the negotiation of a new international legally binding agreement aimed at tackling the issue of plastic pollution. So that's good news on the international front. Negotiations will definitely be tough, but it may yield some good results when it comes to addressing the issue of plastic pollution. At the national level, there are so many different measures that can be put in place. Rwanda, for instance, has a plastic ban which has served the country very well. I doubt there's someone from Rwanda here, but if there's someone who lives in Rwanda, for instance, I'm sure the person can share some experiences on that front. Plastic rubber bags, as we have in several West African countries in abundance, are not used in the Rwandan context. And that is definitely a good first step to addressing the issue of plastic pollution. There are several other measures that can be put in place. How good am I on time? Lawrence, can I go on the issue of plastic pollution?
Yes, you can.
I can. Okay, good. So beyond the issue of, for instance, instigating a ban on the use of plastics, of course, there would definitely be the need to come up with innovative approaches to recycling plastic waste. Because let's be realistic, the truth is that tons of plastic waste have already been produced, and that plastic will continue to remain on our planet for some of the forms of plastic waste for centuries. So there's also the need to begin to look at approaches to recycling plastic waste, because it doesn't matter whether or not the plastic is generated on land or used on land, it eventually finds its way back to the ocean through gutters, which then drain off into river bodies, which then drain off into the ocean. So we have to begin to look at active approaches to recycling the plastic waste that has already been generated, to looking at alternatives to the plastic that is produced. Because once we do not get viable alternatives, consumers who do not understand the depth of the plastic pollution issue may continue to engage in acquiring plastics as if there was no problem at all, and may not be conscious in their efforts to recycle their plastic waste accordingly. Which then brings us to the other dimension of generating public awareness about the issue. And I think the onus lies on each and every one of us. We definitely have friends and colleagues who are completely ignorant about plastic and the damage that it is causing to the ocean. Like I said, there's, of course, generally the misconception that once I'm using this plastic, dropping this plastic sachet of water on land, there's no way it can end up in the ocean. But beginning to allow people to understand how plastic waste ends in the ocean and the damage it's causing to the marine environment will open them up to exploring different approaches to dealing with the problem. Ignorance cannot be left as it is, because that would only deepen the issue of plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. We'll take this last question and we'll appreciate a brief response from you on that. Do we have institutions in Africa that supervise illegal and ghost fishing?
Or is this in charge of each state? Okay, so off the top of my head, I do not know of an institution in Africa that supervises illegal fishing. There are frameworks that attempt to address the problem at the regional level. Definitely frameworks that attempt to address the problem at the international level. So there are legal frameworks in place that provide general guidance on the issue of illegal fishing. What happens though is that illegal fishing is often perpetrated in national waters. So states have the onus to sort of manage their fisheries resources to ensure that at the state level, the laws and regulations are in place to address the issue of illegal fishing. I believe on 2 different occasions, one more recently, Ghana has been known to be in violation of several sorts of illegal fishing regulation violations. So the EU, for instance, presented Ghana with a yellow card. That by no means is an international punishment in a sense, but what the yellow card meant for Ghana was that it limited Ghana's ability to export fish to the EU. So that, in a sense, was problematic. But what that did was to, especially the first time it happened, was to force Ghana to update its fisheries laws and regulations to ensure that the canker is to some extent addressed. So the onus really rests on states to work towards updating their fisheries laws and regulations accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time is fast spent, but I would like to just take this very last one from Mercy, and she's asking, what about the other harmful chemicals discharged into our oceans?
Yes, beyond the much bigger issue of oil spillage, there are other side issues that we are normally generally ignorant to. For instance, there's the issue of ballast water from ships that is often released into other waters. The thing is that when you look at marine ecosystems, sometimes they are highly dependent on a certain sorry. They are highly dependent on the specific set of conditions within the marine environment of a particular location. So the ballast water that is in ships, for instance, could contain species that may be highly suitable for one particular marine environment, but that when sort of moved to another marine environment and released there could be invasive species. So you would then have a situation where those species preclude other very crucial species and ecosystems in the new location from thriving. So this is just a simple example. So it really goes beyond the issue of plastic pollution. There are several smaller undertones. There's the issue of ballast water. And beyond the issue of the larger plastics that we see, there are microplastics that also sift off into the ocean from even the cosmetics that we use, from cosmetics and from makeup. You know, you might be applying makeup on your face on land or inland and have no idea that some way, somehow, millions of microplastics will be released into the ocean once you take a bath or wash your face and the water sifts along drains into rivers and then ultimately into the ocean. So I think that's beyond what the time will permit us to delve into, but there are certainly several other chemicals and substances that ultimately pollute our ocean space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you very much for the several reactions. I believe it's been a very educative session so far. And because of the time spent, we'll quickly go to the polls and review the session